Hey everybody, one project a lot of people have asked me to try out is a brisket knife. So today I'm starting a new batch of knives for heat treating and I'm going to throw one in there to try it out. The first step of the process is going to be coming up with a design, so let's go to the computer and do a little bit of research. After scrolling through some articles and looking through some Google images of some brisket knives, I came up with a few key characteristics that I think makes a good brisket knife. And that is a 10 to 12 inch blade, a 5-inch handle, and then a thin grind and blade stock. So now let's go into the shop and do some designing. After doing a lot of sketching, here's the design that I finally came up with. It has a nice long blade and a sizable handle, and I left the tip a bit pointier than you often see on brisket knives, just because I personally find the knives to be much more useful when it has a point on it. And the piece of steel I'm going to be using is this W2 high carbon steel in 3/32 inch thick and 2 inches tall. So now I'm going to cut out my template and put it onto the steel to trace it out. Here's the pattern traced onto the steel. It's not 100% perfect, but that doesn't really matter since I'll be shaping it on the grinder anyway. To profile the knife, I'm going to start by cutting out the rough profile on my portaband. I have a bimetal blade on there that's really good for cutting the metal. Then I'm going to head over to my grinder and use a 36 grit combat abrasive shredder belt to do the profiling. Sometimes when I watch these bandsawing clips, I think back to the old days when I used to have to hacksaw all of my knife blanks out by hand, and I just think how nice of a life that this is. So nice and fast. Once the rough profile is done on the bandsaw, I move over to my grinder and the flat platen with a 60 grit worn out ceramic belt. I like to use the worn out belt because I don't want to waste the nice fresh grit of a fresh belt on the profiling steps, because that often just shreds the abrasives off of the belt and really shortens the life of that belt. And then to get to the inside radii of the bottom area of the handle, I switch to a small wheel attachment and grind in that area where your fingers go. Alright, so now that this is fully shaped, I can definitely say that it's going to be the largest knife that I've ever made, and it is a beast. So now what's next is going to be drilling the pin holes in the tang, and I'm going to do that over here on the drill press. One quick tip before I drill the holes, I like to draw a little Sharpie line of where I think the grind and the front of the handle will go, and that just helps me align where I'm going to put the pins. Because sometimes if you don't do that, then I'll put the pinhole too far up, and then that goes too close to the front of the handle, and that can make the handle material a little bit fragile. These holes are being drilled with a 17/64 drill bit because I like to be able to have enough room on the outside of the pins for extra glue to catch. Here are the holes all done. I got the pin holes and also drilled a lot of extra weight reduction in epoxy holes. And then I just put a larger drill bit into my drill and did some little countersinking just to remove the burr off the edges of the holes. At this point I have two options. The first would be to grind some pre-heat treat bevels before the knife is hardened. The advantage to that is that it's a little bit easier to grind the steel before it's hardened. But the disadvantage is that when you grind some preheat treat bevels, you have a little bit more chance to get some warpage in the blade. So I think with this one, since it has a really long blade, I'm just going to heat treat it at full thickness. And then I'll just grind the bevels all after heat treating. To heat treat this, I'm going to stick my knife into the even heat kiln at 1475 degrees. Then I'm going to let it soak at that temperature for 10 minutes. And I'm going to quench it in my Parks 50 oil. Once the knife has been soaking for 10 or 15 minutes, I put on my heat-proof gloves, and then I quench the knife in the preheated Parks 50 quench oil. Alright, so out of the quench, the knife is almost perfectly straight, so I'm not going to hardly have to do any straightening at all. And it also passes the file test, so the file is just skating across, which means the blade is nice and hard. So what I'm going to do now is going to let the oven cool down to 400 degrees and then do 2 tempering cycles of 2 hours each. Alright, well, it's been a few busy months in the shop and I haven't had any time to work on the brisket knife, but now it's finally time to finish it off. I got some really beautiful desert ironwood scales, and I'm going to go ahead and do the finish grind on the blade before attaching those. Since the blade is still at full stock thickness, I'm going to go ahead and do a 36 grit shredder belt for the initial grind instead of my normal 60, because I have a lot of material to remove, and that way I'll be able to get that done quickly and efficiently. And then I'm going to move up through a grit progression of a 60 grit, 120 grit, and then I have an A100 Trizact, and then a 65 Trizact, and then over here I have a couple of different Scotch-Brite finishing belts that I'll use to give the blade a nice final satin finish. When I'm starting the grind, I always make sure that I cut in the rough 45-degree bevels to give me something to grind to, and then I make sure that I periodically dip the knife into the water bucket that I have below my grinder, and that enables me to keep the blade nice and cool so that I prevent ruining the temper. Because if you heat the knife up too much and heat it past the tempering point that you heat treated the knife to, then the edge can start to become soft and it'll no longer hold a sharp edge as long. Okay, so here's the blade finished out to a nice and clean blue Scotch-Brite satin finish. And on my kitchen knives, I always like to test the edge thickness by trying to flex the edge a little bit with my thumbnail, which if you look closely, you can see it is doing right there. So what I'm going to do now is head over to the bandsaw and cut out the handle material and then drill the pinholes. Here I'm just drilling the 3/16 inch pinholes through which I'm going to put the mosaic pins to help hold on the handle. So now that the blade and the handle are both ready for gluing, I'm just going to use some G-Flex epoxy and clamps to put it all together and let that cure overnight for shaping tomorrow. Once everything's clamped together, I let the epoxy cure overnight and then I'm ready to shape it. The epoxy is cured and I went ahead and taped up the blade so I don't scratch up the satin finish. Now I'm in the shop and we'll head right over here to my grinder so I can start shaping the handle. I start the handle shaping process by using a small wheel attachment and a 60 grit belt to remove all of the excess handle material from the profile of the knife. Then I use my flat platen and a fresh 60 grit belt since ironwood is really tough to grind and I want to make sure that it doesn't burn to start cutting in some rough contours. In order to contour the underside of the handle, where the fingers kind of curl around, I like to use the tracking wheel on the top of my grinder, and that allows me to cut in the nice radius for your back fingers when you're gripping the knife. Here you can see that I have all of the rough shaping done. So I have some facets in here in the underbelly of the handle as well as in the finger choil. And then I have this roughly rounded over. So what I'm going to do now is remove the platen from my grinder so I have a slack belt, and then I'll use a scalloped J-Flex 220 grit belt so that I can blend everything nicely together. Now I'm just hand sanding the handle, starting at 320 grit, and then going through a progression of 320 to 600 to 1000, and then finally 2000 grit. Here's the handle after polishing it up to 2000 grit. It's nice and shiny, but we're going to take that to another level by using the buffing attachment on my grinder with some pink scratchless buffing compound. You can see that the buffer gives it a really high gloss and almost glassy appearance, which I really think helps bring out the grain in this desert ironwood. Now all that's left are some finishing touches. So what I'm doing here is putting in a little recess where your fingers go and contact the blade in a pinch grip, and that just makes it a little bit more comfortable to hold. And then I'm polishing up the outside perimeter of the knife just so that all of the scratches from the handle shaping process are taken out. And then finally, I'm doing the final sharpening of the edge, which I do with a 120 grit belt, then a 400 grit trizact, and finally I take off the burr using this leather stropping belt. And the very last thing I'm doing is using an electro etching machine and a stencil to put our logo onto the blade. And then the very last step is to test it on some brisket. It cuts smooth as butter. And that's how I made my brisket knife. If you have any questions about the process, please leave them in the comment section below and I'll answer them and try to help you out as best as I can. Thanks a lot for watching, and be sure to stay sharp and enjoy those smoked meats.